Well, our big focus, the Prime Minister's touchdown in Singapore. Well, Prime Minister Modi is in a bilateral meeting with his Singapore counterpart, Lawrence Wong. This visit, as we've been covering, is expected to see the two sides making efforts to boost cooperation in areas like advanced manufacturing, maritime connectivity, aviation, skills, as well as healthcare. Now, as per reports, among the big key takeaways will be an MOU for cooperation in the semiconductor sector, in which Singapore is a global leader. And Singapore, as you know, has been a long-term investor in India. In fact, since 2000 till now, we have an accumulative FDI of $160 billion US. Here are the details.
After 6 years, Prime Minister Narendra Modi is visiting Singapore at the invitation of his Singaporean counterpart, Lawrence Wong.
Prime Minister is visiting Singapore after nearly 6 years. In fact, his last visit to Singapore was in his first term as Prime Minister, and an early visit during his third term is something that is particularly welcomed by the Singaporean side. And also this is at the time when a new leader in Singapore, in His Excellency Prime Minister Lawrence Wong, has just taken over, and this is an opportune time to set the stage for the next stage of our vibrant bilateral relationship.
The visit comes a week after the second round of India-Singapore Ministerial Roundtable held in Singapore. The Indian delegation included Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, Foreign Minister Dr S. Jaishankar, Commerce Minister Mr. Piyush Goyal, and Information and Broadcasting Minister Ashwini Vaishnav. The meet reviewed progress of key bilateral issues and identified advanced manufacturing and connectivity as thrust areas. As India's sixth largest trade partner and largest source of FDI, PM's visit is expected to push the pedal on bilateral trade.
Singapore is India's sixth largest trade partner worldwide and the largest source of FDI during the last financial year. Investments have also been very large. Since 2000 till now, we have had cumulative FDI of about $160 billion US.
One area of interest or congruence between the two countries is semiconductors, and Singapore has a wide range of expertise in manufacture, fabricating, or even producing semiconductors in its region. And India will be expecting a deeper and serious cooperation with Singapore in this domain.
India has deep strategic and commercial interests in Singapore. There are over 9,000 Indian companies registered in Singapore. 80% of listed offshore bonds by Indian issuers are listed on Singapore Stock Exchange. In February 2023, India's UPI and Singapore's PayNow connected for speedier remittances between the two nations. The visit comes as India is countering Chinese influence in its maritime domain by pushing ahead its Act East policy. As New Delhi continues to build on its role as a major player in the Indo-Pacific, these visits will pave the way for deeper strategic and trade collaboration between India and the entire ASEAN region. Mohammad Ghazali for NDTV.
And joining us for further clarity, my colleague Mohammad Ghazali, also with us on the broadcast, Dr. Jonah Blank, senior political scientist. We will just go across to Dr. Blank. Ghazali, as we know, the Singapore agenda, well, MOUs are on the radar. We hear that MOUs will be signed for cooperation in manpower skilling in the semiconductor sector. So from skilling centers to training and recruitment by Singapore firms will all be catered to?
Yes, certainly. This particular visit of Prime Minister is focused on bringing out something new from this partnership between India and Singapore when it comes to the semiconductor technology. We know, as you rightly mentioned, and the report also said that how Singapore is known as one of the pioneer nations in the world when it comes to semiconductor technology. India is looking for a deeper and a serious cooperation with Singapore. So India will also provide its own manpower for training, skilling, and there will be a better coordination with Singapore when it comes to semiconductor technology. We will have to see that what will be the contours of those MOU, which will be signed today. But semiconductor remains the main focus of the government, because besides semiconductor, we already have defense cooperation with Singapore. We have trade ties, as you rightly mentioned, that in the last financial year, Singapore was the largest source of our FDI. So when it comes to trade, manufacturing, defense, these ties are already there. But this semiconductor technology is one thing which will be, which is one key area of focus. The officials here in the External Affairs Ministry have hinted it before the Prime Minister embarked on this 3-day visit to Singapore and Brunei. And in Singapore today, Prime Minister is also going to meet CEOs of different Singapore's companies, and also a meeting with the Prime Minister, his counterpart, where the bilateral talks and all these MOUs will be signed.
As always, Ghazali, thanks so much for joining us with the latest update. Let's also rope in Dr. Blank, who's also a Senior Research Fellow at the National University of Singapore. Thanks so much, Dr. Blank, for making time for us on the World 24/7. Is the Prime Minister's touchdown in Singapore, our Prime Minister's touchdown in Singapore, right after a few hours in Brunei, on ground zero, is it being perceived as one with a goal to play a bigger role in the region where China has a major influence?
Well, this is definitely seen as something that is in line with Singapore's own goals for the region. And it's been 6 years since India has come. From a Singaporean perspective, that's quite a long time.
Right.
I think one of the big questions is for the semiconductor deal, from a Singaporean perspective, where are the semiconductors going to be produced? Because Singapore wants not simply to invest in India's industry in this regard, it wants to actually build its own semiconductor industry.
Right, but we also know, meanwhile, that the visit comes shortly after Mr. Lawrence Wong assumed office as the new Prime Minister of Singapore. Dr. Blank, how does the government in Singapore view Narendra Modi as the leader of the world's largest democracy?
Well, Singapore very much wants to have closer ties with India. Singapore is already a very close security partner with India, and this is a part of the discussion that both countries want to solidify but keep a little bit out of the public eye. So I think it's pretty safe to assume that there were a lot of security discussions behind closed doors that were not really broadcast as much to the general public.
We're also hearing that some Singaporean sovereign wealth funds are planning to expand their portfolio in India. In fact, certain reports highlight that Temasek is reportedly looking to invest about $10 billion in India over the next few years. Any credible word on that yet, Dr. Blank?
Well, as your report has so rightly pointed out, Singapore is already the 6th largest trading partner of India, and last year was the largest source of foreign direct investment. From a Singaporean perspective, there's a constant hunger to find new investment opportunities in the region. Traditionally, Singapore has focused a lot of that in Southeast Asia, and I think a lot of Singapore investment would really like to expand that into India.
In fact, you know, Dr. Blank, some people argue that if there was ever a study in contrast between two nations, India and Singapore would probably be great contenders because on size, on population, GDP per capita, even landmass, both countries are poles apart, and yet the history of both our countries has been one of sustained mutual respect and also trying to carve out a unique space for themselves, especially in a multipolar world. Do you share the same assessment?
Yes, it's true. On the surface, they really would seem to have very little in common. In fact, having lived in both countries, I can say there are a lot of similarities in the area that both are multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural nations in their very core. You can't really take out the different strands in either nation. Neither nation would be what it was if it were not a tapestry.
Well, thank you so much, sir, for joining us with your thoughts. We will, of course, revert to you for regular updates while Prime Minister Modi has touched down in Singapore.